September 1943, Massachusetts. The train carrying German prisoners of war screeched to a halt at Fort Devens, a military camp nestled in the heart of New England. Among the dozens of women stepping off that train was Clara Müller, a 28-year-old nurse captured during the North African campaign. Her hands trembled, not from the cold autumn air, but from the gnawing uncertainty of what awaited them behind those wire fences. Clara had heard the stories. Every prisoner had. Tales of starvation camps, brutal interrogations, forced labor until collapse. The propaganda ministers in Berlin had painted vivid pictures of American cruelty, of prisoners treated worse than animals. As she stepped onto American soil for the first time, her mind raced with these dark expectations. Her body still ached from weeks of travel across the Atlantic, squeezed into the belly of a transport ship where the smell of vomit and fear became inseparable. The gates of Fort Devens opened before them like the mouth of some great unknown beast. Clara straightened her back, forcing her expression into stone. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Around her, younger women whispered prayers in German, their voices barely audible over the sound of military boots on gravel. Some clutched photographs of families they might never see again. Others simply stared ahead, eyes empty, already defeated by circumstances beyond their control. But something felt wrong, disturbingly wrong. The camp before them looked nothing like the nightmares they had been prepared for. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows, their paint fresh and clean. Guard towers rose at the corners, yes, but the soldiers manning them seemed almost bored, not threatening. There were no emaciated prisoners visible through the fences, no signs of torture or starvation. The entire scene radiated an unsettling orderliness that made Clara's trained instincts scream warnings she couldn't quite articulate. An American officer approached their group, clipboard in hand. He spoke in broken German, his accent almost comical, explaining the camp rules and daily schedules. Clara listened carefully, searching for hidden threats in his words, but found only bureaucratic efficiency. They would be assigned barracks. They would receive work assignments. They would follow regulations. Nothing about his tone suggested the sadistic cruelty she had been conditioned to expect. As they were led toward their assigned barracks, Clara naturally assumed the role she had always held. The leader, the protector, the one who maintained order when chaos threatened. The younger women looked to her for guidance, and she accepted this responsibility without hesitation. She had been a supervisor in German military hospitals before her capture. Leadership was not new to her. Inside the barracks, wooden bunks lined the walls, each with actual mattresses, not straw pallets or bare boards. Blankets lay folded at the foot of each bed. The floor was swept clean. Windows let in afternoon light. Clara touched the mattress cautiously, as if it might disappear like a mirage. This comfort felt like a trap, a psychological weapon designed to lower their defenses before the real punishment began. What game were the Americans playing? What did they want? Clara's mind churned with questions as she claimed a bottom bunk near the door, the position of responsibility where she could monitor who came and went. Around her, the other women unpacked their meager possessions, their movements hesitant, uncertain. The first test, Clara knew, would come soon, and she would be ready. Whatever the Americans had planned, she would protect her fellow prisoners. She had to. Because in this strange new world, where enemies offered comfort instead of cruelty, trust itself had become the most dangerous thing of all. The morning sun filtered through the barracks windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Clara had barely slept. Every creak of the building, every distant footstep had jolted her awake. Her body tensed for the violence she still expected to come, but nothing had happened. The night had passed in unsettling peace, broken only by the quiet sobbing of a young woman 2 bunks away, who whispered her mother's name in her sleep. A bell rang across the compound. 6 o'clock. A guard appeared at the barracks door, knocking politely before entering. Politely. The word itself seemed absurd in this context. He gestured for them to follow, his expression neutral, almost friendly. The women exchanged nervous glances, and Clara nodded, giving them silent permission to comply. They were led to a large dining hall, and what Clara saw there stopped her in her tracks. Long tables stretched across the room, already set with plates, cups, and utensils. The smell hit her next, rich, sweet, completely foreign. Her stomach clenched painfully, reminding her that she hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. Steam rose from serving stations where American cooks moved with practiced efficiency, piling food onto plates with alarming generosity. Clara approached the serving line cautiously, her eyes scanning everything like a field surgeon assessing a battlefield. A cook smiled at her, actually smiled, and placed 3 golden circles onto her plate. Pancakes, she would later learn they were called. He drizzled dark amber liquid over them, the syrup pooling around the edges. Beside this, he added strips of crispy bacon and scrambled eggs that glistened with butter. She stared at the plate in her hands, as if it contained poison. Behind her, the other women received similar portions, their faces reflecting the same mixture of confusion and desperate hunger that twisted inside Clara's chest. This abundance made no sense. In Germany, even before her capture, food had been rationed severely. The civilian population survived on black bread and thin soup. Soldiers ate only slightly better, and prisoners of war. Prisoners were supposed to starve. Clara found a seat at one of the tables and set down her plate without touching it. She watched as some of the younger women immediately began eating, their hunger overriding their caution. Others, like her, simply stared at the food, paralyzed by suspicion. What did the Americans want in exchange for this? What information did they hope to extract? Was the food drugged, poisoned? Or was this simply a more sophisticated form of torture, offering comfort before yanking it away, breaking their spirits through false hope rather than direct cruelty? A guard walked past their table carrying his own breakfast, identical to theirs. He ate casually, drinking coffee from a tin cup, completely unconcerned. If the food was poisoned, he showed no fear of it. Clara's fork hovered over the pancakes. The sweet smell was intoxicating, making her mouth water despite her determination to remain vigilant. Her hand trembled slightly as she cut a small piece, examining it closely, just one bite, just to understand what game they were playing. The fork touched her lips, and everything she thought she knew about her captivity began to crumble. The sweetness exploded across her tongue like nothing Clara had ever experienced. The pancake was soft, warm, almost melting in her mouth, and the syrup, that dark amber liquid, carried a complexity of flavor that seemed impossible. For a moment, she forgot where she was, forgot the war, forgot everything except the overwhelming sensation of actual sustenance entering her body. She swallowed, and immediately her survival instincts screamed at her to stop. This pleasure was dangerous. This comfort was a weapon. She set down her fork with deliberate force, the metal clanking against the plate loud enough to draw glances from nearby women. Across the table, a young woman named Greta, barely 20 years old, ate with tears streaming down her face. Not tears of sadness, but something else entirely, relief perhaps, or grief for all the meals she had missed, all the hunger she had endured. Beside her, another prisoner named Frida ate slowly, methodically, as if trying to make each bite last forever. An American guard approached their table. Clara tensed immediately, her body preparing for confrontation. The man was young, perhaps 30, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. He carried a coffee pot in one hand and gestured toward their cups with a questioning expression. "More?" he asked in heavily accented German, the single word mangled but understandable. Clara stared at him, searching for mockery in his face, for cruelty hiding behind that mild expression. She found nothing but simple courtesy, the kind a waiter might show at a civilian restaurant. It made her deeply uncomfortable. When she didn't respond, he moved on to Greta, who nodded eagerly. He filled her cup with dark coffee, then added cream and sugar without being asked. Greta whispered, "Danke, thank you," so quietly it was barely audible. The guard smiled, said something in English that none of them understood, and continued down the table. Clara watched him go, her mind racing to construct a framework that made sense of this behavior. Psychological warfare. It had to be. Break them with kindness, make them dependent on American generosity, then use that dependence as leverage during interrogations. But then the guard returned, stopping directly beside Clara. He pointed at her plate, where most of the food remained untouched, and raised his eyebrows in question. When she didn't move, he made a gesture toward the serving line, then back to her plate, as if asking whether she wanted more or different food. The absurdity of the situation hit her like a physical blow. Here stood an enemy soldier, in an enemy camp, in an enemy country, offering her, a prisoner of war, additional food because she wasn't eating enough. "9," she managed to say, her voice rougher than intended. "No." The guard shrugged good-naturedly and moved on. But something in that brief interaction had shifted. Clara looked down at her plate again, at the cooling pancakes and congealing eggs, and felt something crack inside the careful armor she had constructed around herself. Slowly, almost against her will, she picked up her fork again. This time, she didn't stop after one bite. She ate mechanically, efficiently, telling herself it was simply practical to maintain her strength. But with each mouthful, the wall between enemy and human being grew a little thinner, and that terrified her more than any threat of violence ever could. What happened when the monsters you were taught to hate started treating you like a person? 3 days passed in a rhythm that felt increasingly unreal. Each morning, the bell rang at 6. Each morning, the women were led to the dining hall. Each morning, the food appeared in quantities that seemed designed to mock everything Clara had experienced in the final years of the war. But it wasn't just the abundance that unsettled her, it was the consistency. The Americans didn't waver. There were no sudden withdrawals of privileges, no cruel reversals designed to break their spirits. The meals simply continued, reliable as clockwork, transforming the extraordinary into routine. Clara found herself studying the camp with a military strategist's eye, searching for the hidden purpose behind this treatment. She observed the guards during their shifts, noting how they rotated positions, how they interacted with prisoners. She watched the cooks in the kitchen, visible through serving windows, as they prepared industrial quantities of food, with the efficiency of men who had done this thousands of times before. The other prisoners were adapting faster than she was. Greta had gained weight, the hollows beneath her cheekbones filling in, her movements becoming less fragile. Frida laughed at something another woman said during lunch. Actual laughter, bright and genuine. The sound felt foreign in this place, like birdsong in a graveyard. One afternoon, while the women sat in the common area of their barracks, a guard appeared carrying crates. He set them down with a nod and left without explanation. The prisoners approached cautiously, and Clara stepped forward to investigate. Inside were books, German books, along with writing paper, pencils, and decks of cards. A younger woman named Anna picked up one of the books, her hands trembling as she read the title. "Die Buddenbrooks," she whispered. "Thomas Mann, Literature from Home." She clutched it to her chest like a holy relic, and Clara watched as tears carved paths down the girl's face. This was the moment Clara felt her own defenses truly beginning to crumble. Books meant the Americans expected them to have leisure time. Writing paper meant they were allowed to maintain their humanity, their connections to the world beyond the wire. These weren't the actions of captors preparing prisoners for brutality. That evening, during dinner, Clara accepted a second helping of mashed potatoes, when the same guard from the first morning offered them. She didn't plan to do it. Her hand simply lifted her plate automatically, her body overriding her mind's protests. The guard smiled, that same gentle, uncomplicated smile, and loaded her plate with food that in Germany would have fed a family for days. "Gut?" he asked, attempting the German word for good. Clara looked at him directly for the first time, really looked at him. He was someone's son, probably someone's husband. He had freckles across his nose and a small scar above his left eyebrow. He was just a man doing a job, in a war he likely didn't fully understand either, trying to show basic human decency in circumstances that made such things complicated. "Ja," she heard herself say. Yes. Good. The admission felt like surrender, and perhaps it was. But as she ate that second helping, surrounded by women who were slowly remembering how to be more than just survivors, Clara began to understand something profound. Vulnerability wasn't always weakness. Sometimes accepting help was the bravest thing a person could do. That night, she slept through until morning without waking once. 2 weeks into her captivity, Clara sat on her bunk writing a letter home, a letter the guards had assured her would be delivered through the Red Cross. The blank paper had mocked her for an hour, the pencil heavy in her hand, because what could she possibly say that would make sense? How could she explain to her mother in Hamburg that the Americans fed her 3 meals a day, that they provided clean water, medical care, even recreation time? How could she reconcile these facts with the letters she had received from home, describing bombed-out buildings, ration cards that bought almost nothing, children picking through rubble for anything edible? The propaganda she had absorbed for years whispered accusations in her mind. The Americans were decadent, wasteful, spiritually corrupt. They were the enemy. She had been trained to see them as oppressors, as threats to everything she held sacred. But these same Americans had treated her wounds after capture, had given her more food in 2 weeks than she had seen in the previous 6 months, had returned her dignity when she expected only degradation. Which truth was real? Or were both somehow true simultaneously, creating a contradiction she lacked the tools to resolve? During lunch that day, Clara watched a guard named Miller, she had learned some of their names, interact with Greta. The young woman had been crying again, overwhelmed by news that her hometown had been heavily bombed. Miller didn't speak German well, but he sat down across from her anyway, his presence solid and comforting. He didn't try to fix her pain or minimize it. He simply sat there, occasionally pushing a cup of water closer when she needed it, offering the only thing he had, his humanity. Clara felt something shift painfully in her chest. This was the enemy. This man showing kindness to a weeping German girl who, in another context, might have cheered for his death. She thought of her brother, Klaus, fighting somewhere on the Eastern Front. She thought of the Russian prisoners she had seen in German camps, skeletal figures with haunted eyes, treated like animals, worked until they collapsed. The contrast was impossible to ignore, and it filled her with a shame so profound she could barely breathe around it. That evening, Clara approached Miller during his rounds. She had rehearsed the words in her limited English, her accent thick but her meaning clear. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why this?" She gestured around the camp, encompassing the food, the shelter, the basic human decency that permeated everything. Miller looked confused for a moment, then understanding dawned. He thought carefully before responding, speaking slowly so she might understand. "Geneva Convention," he said, tapping his chest where his heart would be. Then he added something that her limited English could just barely grasp. "Right thing. Right thing." As if morality could be that simple. As if treating prisoners humanely wasn't a strategy or a weakness, but simply the correct way to behave, regardless of circumstance. Clara returned to her bunk that night and stared at the ceiling until dawn, her entire understanding of the war and herself cracking apart like ice in spring. The woman she had been was dissolving, and she didn't yet know who would emerge to take her place. October brought cold winds to Massachusetts, and with them a clarity Clara hadn't expected. The camp received additional blankets before the temperature dropped, another small gesture that spoke volumes. The Americans were planning for their long-term comfort, which meant they saw the prisoners as human beings worth protecting, not temporary inconveniences to be discarded. Clara had stopped counting the days since her arrival. The number no longer mattered. What mattered was the slow reconstruction of her understanding of the world, piece by careful piece. She found herself volunteering for kitchen duty, working alongside American cooks who taught her English food words through pantomime and laughter. Flour, they would say, pointing, sugar, salt, eggs. Simple words that became bridges between languages, between nations, between enemies learning to see each other clearly. One afternoon, while peeling potatoes, Clara worked beside a cook named Samuel, an older black man with grey in his hair and hands scarred from years of labor. He hummed while he worked, old melodies that sounded like prayers. When Clara accidentally cut her finger, he immediately stopped her, wrapped it carefully, and insisted she sit down despite her protests. "You take care," he said in his limited German, his dark eyes warm with genuine concern. Important. Important. She was important to this man she had never met before, whose country was at war with hers, whose skin color the Nazi propaganda had taught her to despise. The cognitive dissonance was so profound, It made her dizzy. During dinner that evening, when Miller made his usual rounds, Clara did something she hadn't planned. She smiled at him. Their real smile, small but genuine, acknowledging their strange friendship built on broken language and unexpected kindness. His face lit up with surprise and pleasure, and he responded with an exaggerated bow that made several of the German women laugh. The sound of that laughter, free and unforced, was perhaps the most revolutionary thing Clara had heard since arriving at Fort Devens. Later, in the barracks, Anna read aloud from the Thomas Mann novel while other women listened, mending clothes or writing letters. Clara sat among them, no longer standing guard, no longer maintaining the rigid separation between leader and leadee. They were simply women together, finding small pockets of normalcy in abnormal circumstances. Frida spoke up during a pause in the reading, her voice thoughtful. "Do you think they're like this with all prisoners? Or is it just because we're women?" The question hung in the air, complex and uncomfortable. Clara considered it carefully before responding. "I think," she said slowly, choosing her words with precision, "that these particular men have chosen to be decent. Not because of orders, not because of our gender, but because they believe it matters. And perhaps that's the most important lesson we can learn from this, that even in war, even when you have every excuse to be cruel, you can still choose otherwise." Greta looked up from her letter, her young face serious. "Will we remember this? When we go home, will we remember that the enemy treated us better than we sometimes treated each other?" The question was dangerous, potentially treasonous, but Clara didn't silence it. Instead, she met Greta's eyes with understanding. "We must remember," she said quietly. "That's our responsibility now." December 1943. Snow blanketed Fort Devens in white silence, transforming the camp into something almost peaceful. Clara stood at the window of the barracks, watching flakes drift past the lights, and marveled at how much had changed in 3 months, not in the camp, but inside herself. The woman who had stepped off that train in September, rigid with fear and hatred, felt like a stranger now. That Clara had been shaped by propaganda, by desperation, by a worldview that painted everything in absolutes, friend or enemy, strong or weak, victor or victim. She had believed the world was simple because simplicity felt safer than the terrifying complexity of truth. Behind her, the other women prepared for Christmas, a celebration the guards had encouraged them to organize. There would be a small tree donated by a local church. There would be carols in German, which the Americans would listen to without understanding the words but appreciating the spirit. There would be extra rations of cookies and coffee, small luxuries that had become the language of their captors, continued humanity. Clara turned from the window to find Greta approaching, holding 2 cups of hot cocoa, another impossibility that had become routine. The young woman had transformed dramatically over these months, her fragility replaced by something stronger, more resilient. "I've been thinking about what happens after," Greta said, sitting beside Clara on her bunk. "When the war ends, when we go home." "And what conclusion have you reached?" Clara asked, accepting the cocoa. "That we'll have to rebuild everything. Not just buildings, but ideas. The things we believed about the world, about ourselves, about other people." Greta paused, her expression thoughtful beyond her years. "These men here, Miller, Samuel, all of them, they showed us that the enemy we were taught to fear was just another lie among many lies." Clara nodded slowly. "But will anyone believe us? When we tell them that American prisoners of war received better treatment than German civilians, will they think we've been brainwashed? Will they call us traitors for recognizing our captors' humanity?" The question had haunted her for weeks. The guilt of eating well while her family starved, of sleeping soundly while bombs fell on German cities, of finding moments of genuine peace while the world burned. It was almost unbearable. "As perhaps that's exactly why we must speak," said Frida Hugh, who had been listening nearby. "Someone has to remember that even in darkness, there were people who chose light. Someone has to carry that truth forward, even when it's uncomfortable." Anna joined them and then others until a small circle had formed. These women who had arrived as strangers, united only by their nationality and their capture, had become something more profound, witnesses to a kind of resistance that had nothing to do with weapons or strategy. Miller appeared at the barracks door for evening county, and the women greeted him with smiles and fractured English. He responded with his usual good humor, mangling German phrases that made them laugh, his presence no longer threatening but welcome. After he left, Clara looked around at her fellow prisoners, her friends, and felt something settle in her chest. Not happiness exactly, but understanding, acceptance, the recognition that life was more complicated than any ideology could contain, and that this complexity was not weakness but truth.